Okay, I'm currently recording. But yeah, you go on. I mean, you were talking about why it took so long to take those areas in Sur.
So back then, we're talking late 2015. At
Hmm.
that point, everybody already knew the peace process was dead because of all the bombings from the ISIS side, and of course the Kurds themselves. They were kind of because the peace process for the PKK was not necessarily actually building peace. It was more of an opportunity to recuperate, re-equip, retrain people because they'd taken some losses since between 2017 and 2011. They took some heavy losses back then. And this is exactly what happened after Öcalan was captured as well. The PKK offered some sort of peace process. They retracted to North Iraq, and then what they ended up doing was just regrouping, re-equipping, retraining people, and then continuing their let's call it just operations. And then that's 1 second. Let me just light up. And
Okay.
this is exactly what happened during Erdogan's era of the peace process. The Kurds re-equipped, and Erdogan at the time gave them a lot of promises that shouldn't have been kept. Like, for example, the PKK could have simply just told the AKP or the AKP official of a district, like, hey, this police chief is stopping us from doing what we want to do. And that police chief would have been sent elsewhere. You probably know the word like sürgün. That's
Yeah,
what we
yeah.
call it. It's like exile. Like, oh, okay, this police chief caused problems for the PKK. We're trying to make peace with them. So let's get rid of this police chief, send him elsewhere, so he won't cause any trouble. And the PKK took this to their advantage. They, for up to 3 years, they just spent a lot of time, resources, and manpower to transport equipment from explosives to firearms from Iraq into Turkey in places like Sur, Cizre, etc., Yüksekova.
And this is actually from a very obviously pro PKK source, but I've actually heard the exact same arguments from the, PKK sources that the Turkish army or the Turkish state wasn't sincere in, maintaining or advancing this peace process. So you kind of believe that it was only the PKK that wasn't sincere in it, or?
No, the Turkish army wasn't sincere in it at all. It was an AKP project more than it was an armed forces project. But of course, back then the armed forces were split as well. I mean, we saw exactly what happened in 2016. Turkish F-16s were bombing empty mountains and then calling it. Well, this was more of like the Gülen's influence back then. Uh, the armed forces were generally split over the issue. I mean, there were of course, a lot of people who weren't sincere about the peace process and they didn't want a peace process. But mainly the Erdogan government at the time wanted the peace process and they were ready to do essentially anything to get this peace process because at the end of the day, it meant more Kurdish votes if there was an actual peace. But it was bound to explode because not enough people wanted it. It was just a political project rather than like the entire resources of the state uh, combining itself to make this peace happen. It was just like one side wanted it to happen really badly, the other side really, really didn't want it to happen, and the Kurds themselves really didn't want it to happen either. That's why it took so long to clear Sur and Cizre. They spent so much time planting explosives in the city, and you could tell they couldn't have made the preparations in a week. Like
Y-
when that guy died in December in 2015, the Tahir Elchi.
Yeah.
Let you, from the time Tahir Elchi died, was killed in Diyarbakir, to the time when the internal operations began, the PKK couldn't have prepared that amount of explosives, personnel, firearms in Sur or Cizre.
Yeah,
The only logical explanation is that they spent the peace process attempting to smuggle firearms and explosives into the region, which kind of shows that they weren't really sincere about it either. It was just more of an opportunity to continue the conflict at a later date when they were more ready for it financially.
Okay, I mean, that's also something that was confirmed by Rudao. Rudao is like the KRG media outlet,
Yeah.
about digging trenches and so forth. I've read similar reports regarding that. But yeah, I mean, like when you are saying the Kurds, obviously, I know that you don't mean the general Kurdish population because obviously the Kurdish population is 15 million in Turkey, and that's a way to, huge group in Turkey to
Yeah.
generalize. But when we are talking about, the southeast, I've actually been to Diyarbakir, by the way, to Sur
Uh-huh.
as well, but after the fighting. Um,
Hmm.
but I mean, like, how would you actually say that? Uh, what would ho- what would be the political, position of the Kurds in Diyarbakir or in southeastern Turkey? Because what my understanding is that, Kurds in other parts of Turkey, so in Turkish majority areas, tend to be like, I'm not saying exactly assimilated, but more integrated.
Yeah.
And then you have also, like I'm from the eastern, I mean, my family is from the eastern part of Turkey, which is like mixed with Turks and Kurds, such as Van, Ardahan, Kars, and so forth. And
Yeah.
the Kurds are either, either just they're just putting up a show, but generally speaking, they are not as excessively nationalistic. But what I did notice in Diyarbakir was, or like, the more homogeneous Kurdish areas, is that, Kurdish nationalism is much more alive there.
Yeah. Kurdish nationalism is much more alive in those areas, and if PKK could possibly operate without the local population support there,
So I mean,
it
like,
would be impossible. Yeah, of course they have a huge amount of support in Southeast Turkey.
so what would be
Massive.
like the political I mean, solution be then?
Uh, I'm not sure if there is necessarily a political solution because Turkey is not willing to go into some sort of federation like they would have in like Russia or a separate parliament like they would have in Scotland or something like that. Turkey's not ready to make that kind of deal due to our weird sense of nationalism. I personally wouldn't support it either, even though I kind of understand that it would resolve the conflict. But the Kurds at this point, the Kurds eventually will just get tired of the conflict as well. I mean, a lot of them already are.
Yeah, but I
There
think
just needs to be an opportunity provided to them to motivate them to actually both stay in Turkey and resolve the conflict at the same time.
yeah, but
Uh,
I wouldn't actually blame, like we always like to blame Turkish nationalism on, Turkish states, how,
mhm.
like the Turkish state behaves. But I mean, like when you are talking about, do you know this film called The Big Short?
No.
I mean, it's like some kind of weird investor who predicted the 2008 crisis, and he's now
Okay.
investing in water and in fertile, fertile grounds. So I mean, like, and he said like, and if you look actually in the Middle East, one of the reasons why I personally think that Turkey invests so much in solving or trying to solve the PKK conflict is because you obviously have the two rivers there, right? The Euphrates and
Mhm.
the Tigris. So,
Yes.
and that actually already gives Turkey a major influence over Syria and Iraq. And in the future, with climate change and all of that stuff going on, you will see that those rivers will become like maybe the gold of the future.
It probably will. I mean, if not already.
So I mean, like,
If not already. I
yeah,
mean, the issue of resources along the Euphrates has long been a debated issue among Turkey and mainly Syria. Not so much with Iraq, but mainly with Syria. I don't know if the Kurds' beef is even financial. I'm not even sure if the Kurds are looking for some sort of financial prosperity in their area. I don't know exactly what their intentions are or what their motives are for supporting the PKK because there's not actually a lot to support about the PKK. Like I said before, I don't think the PKK actually has any intention to run a state to begin with.
but I mean, like,
What the Turkish state fails to do is show the Kurds that because the PKK already makes plenty of money and has plenty of resources from selling drugs to begin with. The PKK is mainly a drug running. They're essentially a very ideological cartel, and
I mean, similar to the FARC, you mean?
similar to the FARC, maybe a bit more powerful because whereas FARC has whereas FARC kind of had rivals. I mean, the drug trade in Colombia is rather huge. The Kurds or the PKK kind of hold a monopoly over it.
Yeah, but I mean,
I
like,
mean, when you think about the drug trade that goes from the Middle East to Europe, 80% of it is Kurdish.
yeah, but I mean, like, I believe that, or at least according to their official organs, they don't really desire some independence, which wouldn't make sense if you think about it, right? Even if you, I mean, like, this is the same thing that will frustrate Turkish nationalists. But if you go to a Turkish nationalist and you would offer him, a German citizenship, he would instantly grab it and move to Germany, right? And the same way would, make the same, the same thing you can say for Kurdish nationalists. Even if
Hmm.
they would talk about some kind of greater Kurdistan, they would obviously
Hmm.
move to, or rather live in a, Turkish Turkey because that's where the higher living standards are. So,
Yeah, of course. But that's human nature.
yeah, but I mean, like, that's one of the reasons why I think that the PKK doesn't really necessarily want an independent state. But I think
Of
that
course.
in a way that no, is actually, I should say it very carefully. Um, in a way, it is logical. I don't want to say justified because I don't really believe in justification for anything politically speaking, but
Hmm.
it is kind of logical if you look at the PKK conflict because I don't think that we can exactly characterize it as a nationalistic conflict, right? It's more like a leftist conflict of, marginalized people. And I think
Hmm.
that's one of the problems in Turkey is that Turkey is, to put it bluntly, a Sunni Turkic supremacist state, I guess you can say. Like, like you're either a Sunni Turk and upper class, and you basically shit on the rest of the country, right? That's kind of
Hmm.
like how Turkey is created. And one of the reasons, and obviously this creates like a lot of repression towards, Kurds, towards, other minorities and so forth. And I think that maybe, I mean, it won't solve the PKK conflict, don't get me wrong, but it would get actually, it would get away a lot of their support by, just giving in into those demands. And what do I mean? Like, not really demands in terms of autonomy. I mean, maybe in terms of cultural autonomy, but I think like in terms of, um, trying to make it more egalitarian, trying to tackle issues such as racism against Kurds in Turkey. I think that if we would focus on those things, yeah, obviously it won't defeat the PKK, but it will actually um, minimize the conflict to a much larger extent.
Hmm. Okay, that's a point.
I mean,
But
it's similar to like what Bismarck did, right? Bismarck was obviously not a leftist, but to destroy the support of the left in Germany, he actually was one of the first European leaders to promote like, socialist policies. And what he actually effectively did was, destroy the socialist support for, I mean, yeah, for the socialist parties.
yes, that's one way that it could be resolved. But in Turkey, a lot of the problems we have is based on politicians not willing to take a risk because a lot of things are just political suicide. Like even the most median, well, what was it?
Moderate.
Not median. Even the most moderate policy change in Turkey could mean political suicide within 5 minutes for anybody who declares it. So there's not anybody enough with enough balls to actually pull that off, even if their intentions were right. And on the flip side of that coin, I don't even think the PKK would want its demands to be met. What people don't remember is that Kurdish tribalism is actually still a very big thing, and most of the PKK's membership still has relatives with huge tribal connections. And if the PKK was to get rid of the conflict with Turkey, this would just remove one obstacle and put an even bigger obstacle in front of them. This would lead to, like, let's say the Kurdish PKK gets some sort of autonomy within Iraq, southeastern Turkey, northeastern Iran. Their next obstacle would be their own relatives, these huge fucking tribes. The Kurds, in that regard, are not that different from Arabs. They have a lot of tribes. Have you ever heard of the PKK attacking a tribe in southeastern Turkey?
I did, but I mean, like, it depends, right? Some tribes are pro-Turkey, some tribes are pro-PKK, and some are in the
Yeah.
middle, I guess.
But how often?
Not often.
Not often, because those tribes would be a bigger headache for them than the Turkish army.
I mean,
Why?
is Kurdish tribalism really that big in amongst the Kurdish population? I know it's big in the KRG, but in Turkey?
Behind every Kurdish nationalist is some sort of tribal connection. I would say, even the communist ones, even communists.
Hmm.
It's they can't escape from it, no matter what they say. I mean, I remember running into one guy. He was a conscript in what was it? Bergama District Gendarmerie, Bergama İlçe Jandarma Komutanlığı.
Hmm.
This was like a university graduate Kurdish guy, kind of progressive. I wouldn't say he was like a Kurdish nationalist. Bergama is a relatively unknown city in Turkey. Bergama is in Izmir, but it's so far away from Izmir. Nobody goes there, even though it has like this excellent history. Despite Bergama being so isolated, this guy had 60 tribal relatives living in Bergama. 60 relatives.
Yeah. I mean,
Now imagine if he had beef with his relatives. I mean,
yeah.
in that Gendarmerie station, there were 28 soldiers. There were more relatives of that guy from, I forgot, Batman. Then there were Turkish soldiers in that district of, not district, in that district, ilçe. Ilçe is a district, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, like, so I mean, like, I mean, there is no political situation in sight. I mean, or solution in sight, and I guess the conflict is just going to continue. So for the foreseeable future, then.
It's in the interest of the Kurds to continue the conflict as well,
I mean, in the interest of
because
the
because they're
PKK.
yeah because their own tribes will cause a bigger headache for them post autonomy than the Turkish army created for them pre autonomy.
Just one question that I have, and there's also some kind of a difficult subject, but when I was watching, some of the combat footage on Twitter and so forth, how would you actually say that, the Turkish military is in terms of its training?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because like sometimes I've seen like videos where Turkish soldiers or even officers were I wouldn't say like Syria level or Arab army level, but we're still, I was like wondering like is this really like some kind of NATO army? I mean, is there some kind of how would I say like what's the type of professionalism in the Turkish military? Is it really like good on standard as in Western armies, or is it a little bit lower than that?
I would say this entirely depends on branch to branch.
So there are
I have a
still,
lot of complaints about I have a lot of complaints about Gendarme, for example,
yeah, suggest.
their level of training.
Is it low?
Not necessarily not no no not necessarily the level of training. The fact that a lot of the soldiers just cannot understand the training. Like Turkish Land Forces Command, Kara Kuvvetler Komutanlığı,
Huh?
it has gained experience beyond any NATO country per ratio. Like on a ratio speaking, for example, Turkish artillery units are probably more experienced than American artillery units because we're constantly rotating every unit. We're pulling units from Greece, from the Greek border, from the Cyprus border, from Izmir, from Ankara. Turkish artillery units have gained an experience in the last 2 years. No, not 2 years. I would say since 2016. Than most of what NATO armies have gained in the last 20 years, or let's be fair, 19 years since the beginning of the global war on terror conflict. And we can't really measure it because Turkey has more mass operations than most NATO countries.
So I mean like
So
when,
when we look at combat footage from, let's say, Belgium, it looks nice. The soldiers are well equipped. They're talking on their fancy radios with their 7 kilogram rifles with 4 different optics on it. But you have to remember, Belgium sends maybe 50 soldiers maximum. While those 50 soldiers might get a lot of good experience, might look very well trained, what can you say about the rest of the Belgian military?
Yeah, I get your point, but so I mean, like you would rather argue that it depends on which branch.
Yes, I would say it depends on branch. I would say Kara Kuvvetler Komutanlığı, the infantry, the professional infantry in Kara Kuvvetler Komutanlığı is could match any level of NATO training.
And like, yeah,
Gendarma, not so much. I mean, there are units within Gendarma, I would say, that can match NATO standards, but a lot of the times it just goes down to soldiers not taking the training seriously. Because lately, due to so much unemployment, even the dumbest guy can get into Gendarma these days.
okay, so that's one of the criticisms that I've seen regarding the gendarmes. But yeah.
Yeah, of course, they spend more time on fucking TikTok than they do reading their fucking training manuals.
And you were in the gendarme, right?
Yeah, I was in Gendarma.
So you kind of regret it and wish that you were in land forces, or?
Actually, you know what? Now, if I could have gone back, I probably would have gone for the Turkish Navy.
Why? Beautiful beaches?
No, Turkish Navy is probably the single most influential, one of the most influential entities in Turkey today.
Yeah, obviously.
Even
But Libya.
at a level that could match Erdogan right now. And their culture, the way they the way they have each other's backs, their sense of loyalty, the way they hold themselves, the way they held themselves accountable for everything. The Turkish Navy is probably the best disciplined, the most influential branch of the Turkish armed forces right now. Jandarma, I love Jandarma. Jandarma is an extension of the state, I would say. If you see Jandarma somewhere, that means the state is there. The problem is over the last few years with the people with the Anatolian. I'm not saying Anatolian villagers are dumb by any means, but the people who didn't have the opportunity to get a proper education and they just don't know. Their parents didn't teach them any discipline. They end up joining Jandarma as some sort of specialist, uzman, and they're mainly doing it for the pictures and the money, more so than actual training, because you could get excellent training in Jandarma. But if the people there aren't going to take it seriously, then no matter what you do to train them, it's not going to change anything.
But I mean, like, it strikes me as, uh, kind of like weird because I mean, obviously you're not one of your quote unquote typical Turks, and you're pretty well educated. You also speak fluent English, and you joined. I mean, like the gendarme. I would have expected you to be like in what's called the Maroon Berets or something like that.
That's a little beyond me. That's a little. As I quit, there's a little beyond me. I mean, I would have strived for it, but yeah, as I quit there. I mean, I met some as I quit guys, and I mean, besides the speaking and fluent English, I would say they're more educated. They know more than me in general. There's some really interesting guys in Özel Kuvvetler. They're like, I wouldn't. They're like academics who can fire rifles. I mean, it's kind of amazing what Özel Kuvvetler is.
That's kind of like how they presented them in the series Bürger, right? But I mean, not the Turkish special forces, but the police special forces.
Police special forces are the ideology that drives Turkey. Police special forces are just straight up amazing. I'm shocked every time I see those guys. They're fucking crazy.
Why? I mean, are they like the typical stereotypical MHP guys, or?
Yes, they are. MHP is the police special forces. Erdogan could send Allah down today and say, Allah, I want to control Turkish police special forces. He couldn't do it.
So it's like really
couldn't do it.
So it's really like some kind of political wing of the MHP, we can say.
Yes. I mean, even the Gülenists tried to penetrate police special forces. That's the one place they couldn't penetrate.
That's like basically the step organization where all the, pure Turks actually, unite.
I don't know if I could say pure Turk, because there's actually a lot of guys in Turkish PSO.
Yeah, I mean,
But
like,
the ideologically speaking, yes.
Okay, so I mean, like, I mean,
ideology.
you kind of get the image that I'm trying to draw, like with the, typical mustaches, the Central Asian
Yes.
look, that, I
Yeah.
mean, usually when you look at those pictures, you kind of see that those are not your, I mean, kind of are your typical Turks, but they have like some kind of distinct Asian look as well.
Yes.
Uh, so it's like
Yeah.
the,
That was actually one of the smartest moves that the Erdogan government, not Erdogan government, but Süleyman Soylu as an extension of Erdogan government. When the Greeks started sending the Greek army during that whole refugee thing,
yeah, yeah,
when
that
when,
he
when
sent
we
them, yeah,
they they didn't send the Turkish army. They sent the police special forces, and the police
yeah,
special forces harassed those guys 24/7.
yeah.
Police special forces don't give a shit. That was actually one of the good policies, I would say. When police special forces went to the field, yeah,
But I mean, like, what kind of an education did you have? I mean, you did have like the what's it called, the Turkish military. You went to the Turkish military high school, right?
yeah,
That they sadly closed down recently.
yeah, and it killed me. I died that day.
Yeah, it's fucked up. Let's just hope that they didn't sell it to Qatar. I mean, some rumors are that they sold it. If that,
There is a retired Gendarmerie NCO who runs a think tank company. He claimed that Kuleli would be reopened for education, and I'm sure it will because Kuleli's been closed down many times. But
oh, okay, okay.
it's impossible. It's impossible to keep Kuleli closed forever, even if it takes 10 years.
And by the way, wasn't there like a recent scandal regarding an admiral regarding this whole Libya crisis?
Admiral Cihat Yaycı.
Yeah, that he was like, moved down because Hulusi Akar was like, didn't really like his close bond with Erdogan.
Yes, and Hulusi Akar is probably the most interesting person of the Erdogan government. What's not so well known about Hulusi Akar is that he was actually brought up in NATO, and he spent some times under NATO command in Naples, I believe it was. And the high-ranking Italian officers there actually called him General Machiavelli due to his pragmatism. Due to his pragmatism.
Because I mean, like, I
And
believe that in his youth he was like kind of a Muslim conservative, right?
you could say that, but I mean, he's also a very well disciplined individual. I mean, that guy served under the armed forces for 49 years and managed to survive somehow. So you can tell he has some sort of skill to keep himself above water. But at the same time, he's very pragmatic.
Oh, so like
That's
politically
why
speaking.
that's one of the reasons Cihat Yaycı was released from his duties, because Cihat Yaycı was carrying the Turkish naval policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, he's not the top ranking admiral in Turkey by any means, but he was carrying the weight of the whole navy. And the guy who replaced him is equally what I would say is he's equally as talented as Admiral Cihat Yaycı. Another guy, the admiral that replaced him was also prosecuted by the Gülens during Balyoz. He spent prison for about 4 years. Uh, I I don't know what's going to happen with Admiral Cihat Yaycı. He's retired now. I mean, yeah. The Turkish military role in Libya is something that should be written down in history books, because with such limited resources, the Turkish army managed to rout the Haftar forces, because in December, Haftar was pretty much ready to take Tripoli.
Yeah, I mean, they say that
It took
Turkey in
it took
Turkish.
about 35 Turkish advisors, about a dozen UCAVs on unmanned combat aerial vehicles, like the Bayraktars and what have you. That's become so famous now. And 4 frigates, plus just logistical support via ship and planes, which was an obstacle all on its own because we were being opposed there by France, Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. Haftar had such an easier time getting the equipment, the resources that he needed because he had Russian support, he had UAE money, and he had Egyptian land logistics support. Turkey did not have any of this.
Yeah, but I mean, like, yeah, there were even like there was even some news outlet, I believe that the New York Times published it, that you even had like Western mercenaries, so from the UK, America, and so forth, that even tried to raid like Turkish cargo ships to,
Yeah,
Libyan national. I mean, not the
yeah,
Libyan
they
national army, but the current UN recognized military.
yeah. But the problem is mercenaries only work. Throwing money at a situation only works if the opposing side is weakened by money. The Turkish army, you can't beat it financially. Like you can beat it financially if you're big enough, but UAE has soft power. They're limited to what they can do. But the Turkish army in the field has the weight. If the Turkish army just throws its weight from Syria to Libya, it can change the outcome of the conflict in a matter of hours. You can send 5,000 PMCs. You can send 200 pilots. The Turkish army can knock out the planes before they even take off because of all the intelligence that's being gathered by MIT on the ground, through the land-based electronic warfare jam and deceive systems that are based by the Turkish Air Force inside Libya, the UAV operators themselves who have gained experience. I mean, the Turkish UAV operators in Syria managed 2,000 hours of flight time in about 8 days. That's a constant flow of 10 aircraft, 24 hours a day for 8 days. And that's just the UCAVs, and that's just one model of UCAV. So you can imagine if you added the F-16 flight hours, the Anka flight hours, the E-7 Boeing flight hours. I mean, the Turkish army shot down 2 aircraft with an F-16 without even locking onto it. They used a third aircraft, which is like a AWACS. The F-16 just launched a missile, 2 missiles, did not lock onto the targets. The aircraft that was 600 kilometers away guided the missiles to the planes, and the guys didn't even know they were locked on until about 2 seconds before they were hit.
So I mean, like,
So all of this is experience. It might not be amazing. Like maybe Belgium can do the exact same thing, but Belgium doesn't have the opportunity to, because it doesn't have a reason to join any conflict to do this.
yeah, I get what you mean. I mean, like, you kind of see it in Turkey as well, like the rise of the military industrial complex, as we
Mm-hmm.
already see, as if we, as if, excuse me, but like we've seen in the United States and so forth. But I mean, like, what would you actually rather say about, the political role? Because in the United States, or from what I see as a Western European, is like that, the military industrial complex has quite a big, lobbying power in Washington, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
can we really see, because like in Turkey, Turkey obviously has a history of, military coups, about military involvement in politics. Can we really
Yeah.
see like some kind of resurgence of, the military in the Turkish political life, or do you think that the Turkish military doesn't really give a shit anymore?
The Turkish military stopped giving a shit. But then again, this changes from period to period. What if they do start giving a shit one day?
Yeah, so I mean, like, I mean, it's rather like this one thing that people often misunderstand, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but usually people tend to think about Turkey as some kind of, country where the military just randomly commits coups, right? Like without any
Mm-hmm.
reason. Whereas, even if you disagree or agree with the coups, I mean, they did happen in like extremely unstable, environments, such as
Mm-hmm.
1990 in 1980 coup, which was
Yeah.
obviously followed by like a lot of um, I mean, which was, caused by the left wing, right wing violence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but other than that, you really think that the Turkish military kind of has embraced this Western concept of, being like a civilian army, or do you think that there is still some kind of political ideology behind it?
The problem with the Turkish military was that after the Cold War, a lot of the Western countries simply did not want to be associated with a country that was known for a militarist way of running the country. We started seeing in 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, etc., documentaries coming about, English documentaries coming out about how the Turkish army has like this grasp and control of the Turkish military. I don't know if you will remember when Abdullah Gül was elected. Well, when Abdullah Gül became president and General Yaşar Büyükanıt, he came out with the E memorandum.
Yeah.
Do you remember the E memorandum?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you remember exactly the next day what happened after the E memorandum?
No, not really.
The European Parliament condemned it and told the Turkish military to respect the policy of the Turkish civilian government. And immediately afterwards, Condoleezza Rice, what was her name? I think that was her name. She didn't comment on it directly, but what she said was, our line is the same as the European Union's, essentially saying the Turkish military should just back off. And that's one of the things that actually weakened the Turkish army, because the Turkish army was more than like, I wouldn't say this was like a 100% agreement among the Turkish ranks, because from what they say, there was actually the idea of a coup in 2004, different from Balyoz, what the Gülenists pushed, like an actual thing was actually thought of. But the thing was, they already knew that the West would have essentially destroyed the country, setting the country back 20, 30 years, which would have ruined their image beyond repair.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I don't really like to blame the European Union for all of these things. At the thing, I mean, like, not really because I don't think that they were doing everything perfectly, but rather because at the end of the day, it's always our fault, right? We always have to look to ourselves first. And in a way, I can understand like that they didn't want really like the military role in politics because, I mean, in a certain extent, I can understand the military role in politics, but then you also have to understand that because like this is the thing with the 1980 coup, right? Some people say that Count Evren was like completely justified in his coup to bring back
Mhm.
stability, but whereas others, and this is somewhat, I wouldn't say conspiracy thinking, but I guess somewhat of conspiracy thinking, which is that that the Turkish military was actually behind the destabilization of the Turkish political life, so they could profit from it, politically speaking. And
I would say both sides are right.
like that, sometimes the Turkish military also profits from these like destabilizations to or keep its influence in the political life.
Not the Turkish military necessarily. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Before this, it was a Cold War policy of the U.S.
Hmm.
To feed destabilization in countries that were in risk of falling into communism at that time. And during the 70s, there was a huge movement from the West, from the East, and a lot of socialists were coming up. Let's just say from the ashes, and there was a lot of destabilization. But the idea of this destabilization was planted in Cold War ideology because, in order to counter the socialist uprising in Turkey, the right wing had to be fed a little bit, which led to this conflict between the left and the right during the 70s. And what the Turkish army did was it just cut off both sides. So maybe the Turkish army didn't directly start this conflict and profit from it, but certainly their allies in the US played a role in starting this destabilization, which ultimately led to the coup. I'm not sure. I can't definitively say that the Turkish army is responsible for the right wing, left wing conflict of the 70s, but I'm not sure. I would say they probably could have prevented it as well.
Okay. So I mean, like, to stop this recording and then post, post it on the podcast channel. Uh, One last question that I have for you is like, how was the food in the Turkish military? Did you guys have like Iskender kebab or something like that, or?
It actually depends. In the smaller gendarmerie stations, for example,
Yeah.
you have a conscript that cooks, and a lot of these guys who are tasked with cooking the food because the material comes uncooked, like all the material comes, like
Yeah, yeah.
so the soldier in question can make any dish out of the material. He doesn't necessarily have to follow the menu. So these smaller stations can be a little more creative and make better food out of the material they have. But then you look at the larger military bases, like Karakuvvetler Komutanlığı, the Land Forces Command.
And you
They have
kind
to
of,
feed
yeah,
like 400 soldiers.
you kind of envy them then.
Yeah, and then they kind of the more food, the more you cook, like the more people you have to cook for, uh, the more the quality drops at the same time. And that was actually a problem of mine because I was based in a lot of smaller gendarmerie stations where the food was supposed to be cooked inside the station fresh. But at some point in 2015, all of the provincial commands in the Gendarmerie stated that in order to do some cost saving, they said that if you were near a bigger military base, the smaller bases should go and pick up the food from the bigger bases, and this dramatically dropped the quality of food that we had.
So no Iskender or manto or something like that.
Not, I've never run into Iskandar, but there's of course beef like köfte, sautéed beef, sauteed chicken, etc. Occasionally, good food does come out. It's not like the nightmare of the early 2000s or the 90s where people were eating like 30-year-old meat
Uh,
taken from the freezers. The food is better now. Of course, there was that whole scandal a few years ago where
yeah,
where the
with
soldiers were being poisoned.
because of the
Yeah.
Akbar, he had some kind of friends, kind of corruption and
Yes.
all of that shit. Anyways,
Yes.
so I will stop the recording. I will post it on the Facebook page and maybe YouTube. I won't really mention your name or something like that. Maybe somebody recognizes your name or whatever, but I won't, I won't mention your name or whatever.